Have you ever read something or heard something or watched something, and the very first thought you had after you watched it or read it was this thought: that's hard to believe. Like, that's just hard to get my mind around. That's hard to process. That doesn't feel very logical. For example, I think, in the last 24 hours in my life, I've experienced this. If you tuned in to the OU Texas game, Matt talked about this if you were here for the welcome, but it's just such a big deal. I got to mention it again. I watched in the first half. I was like, we're back, baby. And the boys and I we were in my living room, and we were jumping up and yelling, and it's like this emotional roller coaster. But the second half, it was a debacle. I couldn't believe it. And at the end of the game, I looked at the scoreboard, and I'm like, I don't believe it. That can't be right. That's just hard to get my mind around. And then, just a few hours later, you may have watched it. I didn't watch it. I just read the headlines that Texas A&M, unranked. Oh, dear. You guys are everywhere. It's just crazy. They beat the number one team in the nation. And when I read that, I was like, are you kidding me? That's just hard to believe. There's so many examples of this. In fact, just this week, I was reading, quite a few things, and I came across some stuff I just read, and I'm like, I don't know if I believe that, but it's true. In fact, think about this. Did you guys know vending machines have killed more people in America than sharks? Like, for real. Like, you are 6 times more likely to die from a vending machine than a shark, which means next time you see one of these, you should play the soundtrack to Jaws. Dun-dun, dun-dun. Be very, very scared. Right? But when you read this and you look at the research, because there's actual research on this, you're like, man, that's just hard to believe. It's hard to get my mind around that. Or I read something this week that, honestly, I had to read it over and over and go to every source I could to make sure this is true, because I was like, it just seems impossible to believe. Did you know that Einstein's autopsy pathologist stole his brain and kept it for 30 years before returning it? Like, Einstein, one of his wishes as he was dying, he said, hey, I don't want my body to be idolized. I just want science to be science and cremate my body. That was his wishes. But his pathologist, Dr. Harvey, had different ideas. He actually took Einstein's eyeballs, and he gave his eyeballs to his ophthalmologist. His ophthalmologist took Einstein's eyeballs, put them in a safety deposit box in New York City. Today, in 2021, Einstein's eyeballs are in a safety deposit box in New York City. That's just crazy. I'm like, no, that can't be true. And then Dr. Harvey took his brain and stored it in his basement for about 30 years, then eventually gave it to science. They looked at his brain, and his brain was a little bit unique, a little bit more compact. It seemed like his neurons fired a little bit quicker. Perhaps, that's the argument. And you read that, and you're like, that just seems impossible. In fact, here's a picture of Dr. Harvey, and that is Einstein's brain. Welcome to church. That's just disgusting there. But that's legit. And again, you look at all the research, you look at all this stuff, and you think to yourself, man, that's not logical. That's just hard. That doesn't feel like that can be true. Well, guys, when it comes to generosity, there's something very similar to that. There's something when it comes to money and generosity that just goes like, I don't think this is true. And here it is, but this is true. Did you know generosity gives you? That generosity is about you? See, that's really hard for our minds to get around. Because when it comes to generosity, again, if you just go down the logical kind of road of generosity, you think, well, generosity, this is what happens. There's a net loss, there's a deficit. If I'm generous to those around me, I look at my bank account, there's less money in my bank account. I could have done a lot of things with that money, but I chose to be generous. And yes, it made me feel good, and yes, there was a sweet feeling and all that, but generosity is not about me. Generosity, logically speaking, is about others. It's I was trying to, do good and advance God's kingdom in the church. I was trying to, help that nonprofit organization build those wells around the world. I was giving to that organization that was helping those children and, with medical needs. And it's really for the benefit of others. That's what I believe when it comes to generosity. Being free and abundantly generous. It's about others. But did you know, if that's what you think, that you would actually be wrong, according to science? That science would say, yes, there's a benefit but it's lowercase W-I-N to benefit those on the other side of generosity. But there's an uppercase, capital letters, W-I-N with 7 exclamation points right here. That generosity does far more for you than it does for those on the other side of you. Again, the empirical research, the empirical evidence, the longest running study, says there are 5 very specific things that it actually does for you. And this is what we all long for in life. Number 1, it says generosity gives you happiness. Happiness. Arguably, this is what this is what we all desire in our life, is happiness. This is why we make the sacrifices and choices and do hard work and do all these kind of things, because ultimately, we just want to be happy. I want my kids to be happy. I want my family to be happy. We all, there's just something like we long for this. Well, the research says that to the proportion you are generous is to the proportion that the door of happiness actually is opened to your life. Not only that, the second thing research says is physical health. There's all kinds of things that certainly impact your physical health, of course. But did you guys know, again, according to the research, that to the proportion of your generosity, it actually has a profound positive impact on your physical health? The third thing science tells us is purpose in life. The idea of, walking around life without purpose, kind of being aimless, to go, there's no objective meaning, there's no real meaning in life. That just, honestly, if that's what you believe, that really feels kind of hopeless. It feels like, man, my life is kind of lost if there's zero purpose. But the research would say, to the proportion of your generosity, you open the door to purpose and meaning and significance in your life. The fourth thing would say avoidance of depression. And again, there's a whole lot of things that impact our mental health. But one of the things that has a positive emotional impact, one of the things that you say, man, I've got hope for the future. I'm excited about tomorrow, next week, next month, the years to come. One of the reasons why you would say that is because of your generosity and whether you are or are not. And the last thing, just personal growth. The idea is, 5 years, 10 years, because this is not the short-term view. The research is more long-term to go, hey, you are consistently generous year after year after year. Long-term says that has a profound personal impact on your personal growth. That 5, 10 years from now, you'll go, man, I love the direction of my life. I love what's going on in my family. I kind of love the outcomes over here. It's really cool. And there are a lot of reasons why. There's this reason, this reason, this reason. But did you know one of the primary reasons, again, science would tell us, is because of generosity. And when you hear that, there's got to be something, perhaps in a lot of us, that would say, I don't know if I believe that. That's really convenient for preachers to say, right? But is that really true? Well, it's a fair question. And here's what you've got to consider. And I really want to encourage you to check this out. One of the longest running, or one of the biggest studies on generosity is called the Science of Generosity Initiative. It was done at the University of Notre Dame by Christian Smith and Hilary Davidson. Now, you should look into Christian Smith and Hilary Davidson. They're phenomenal sociologists. They're very, very well qualified sociologists. They've done a lot of work. And one of their questions that they were trying to solve or find the answer to, if you will, was what's the benefit of generosity? Does it really have a benefit on the people around? Because that's what we think. Or does it have a bigger benefit on you? And so they did this 5-year study, hundreds and hundreds, thousands of individuals. They followed the individuals, followed their families, followed the impact of generosity, because the majority of these people said, there's no way it benefits me more than those around me. And after 5 years, all the research pointed to it's far more beneficial to you. In fact, they put all their research in a book. It's called The Paradox of Generosity. Again, if you're a book reader, or even if not, this is a cool book to read. If you like graphs and stats and percentages and all the different ways to be generous and all this kind of stuff, this is the book. And at the end of the book, it's really cool. They have story after story after story of all these individuals who said, no way does generosity benefit me more than those around me. And then at the end of the book, all those individuals said, I couldn't believe it. It was super hard to get my mind around, but it actually impacted my life far more. And I love that they call it a paradox of generosity, because on the cover of the book, look at the cover of the book, it says, giving we receive, grasping we lose. A paradox is two contradictory terms that, although they're contradictory, they're true. And they said, I'm just telling you. The empirical evidence, the empirical research, which is far more than just the science, that's observation in addition to, says that grasping we actually win, or grasping we lose, that giving we gain. And the summary of the book, they summarized it in this statement. Look at this. The more generous Americans are, the more happiness, health, and purpose in life they enjoy. This is the science. This is the data and research. And so guys, here's the deal. If you've come to Northpoint a while, you know one of the things we say here a lot is that we are for you. And I am for you. And if you've been, around Northpoint, you know that that's absolutely true. I'm 100% for you. If you saw the choices I've made in my life, the sacrifices I've made in my life, which I am glad to do, I mean, they would be data points and indicators to say, really, I'm for you. And I want you to experience this in your life. In fact, I want all of us to take steps and experience this hope for the future, levels of happiness that we haven't experienced before, personal growth, avoidance. I want us to experience that. So this is one of the reasons why I'm so looking forward to this series that we're titling The Paradox of Generosity. Because the tension is, it's a paradox. And over the next few weeks, we're going to look at generosity perhaps from a new angle or through a new lens that you haven't seen it before. And in fact, today, with the information I've already shared, maybe for some of you, you're like, yeah, I didn't even know that about generosity. That's new information. We're going to look at that. And then we're going to look at what's the number one obstacle that keeps us from being generous. I mean, there's a lot of things that kind of get in the way of generosity, but what's the number one thing? We're going to talk about that. And then ultimately, we're going to get to a place to go, what allows us to be more generous? How can we take more steps to be more and more generous? Because the research says to the proportion of your generosity, you actually open the doors to what we long for, the very most in life, wider and wider and wider. So guys, we're going to talk about that over the next several weeks. Now, let me just pause real quick and address something that perhaps is in the room, or for those of you watching or listening or in your living room or wherever you may be, I want to address that. And I don't know how much tension or energy there is around this. I honestly don't. But I do want to lean in. And here's the deal. When you hear me talk, the preacher talk about money and generosity in a church, there may be a flinch in you that you're like, oh, tuning you out, And perhaps you're tuning me out because you're like, you just want our money. I mean, you just want me to give to Northpoint. That's it. So I just can't listen to what we're going to talk about in this series. So I thought about that this week, and I thought, okay, well, that's a fair pushback. I get it. I mean, if I was in your shoes and experienced what you experienced and saw what happened to your parents or saw what happened to your friends, I would probably have the same pushback. So I just thought, how can I be so honest with you? How can I just be brutally honest? And so here's my most honest answer to that pushback. The truth is, I do. I do want you to give to Northpoint. I do want you to be radically generous to Northpoint. And the reason why is because I get a front row seat to see the impact of your generosity. I mean, I get to see how it impacts the next generation with kids and students, and that they're growing in their faith, they're being inspired to grow in their faith. I get a front row seat to that. I get to see how just this last week, a single mom who had plans for the future, I mean, she had a way forward financially. She just needed help this month to pay her mortgage. And I saw, man, because of your generosity, we were able to step in, build that bridge, love her and lead her and allow her to take that next step for her and her kids. I've seen the front row seat or what your generosity does. I've seen what it does with our community. I mean, people in our community and around the world. I mean, you have put literal clothes on the backs of around the world. You have put real food in the stomachs of hungry children around the world. And then when I look at our organization, our church, and see all the different checks and balances and the level of trust here organizationally, I mean, if I'm answering you honestly, I would say, of course I would want you to be generous to what we're doing because I see the genuine impact on people's lives. But if you're watching, if you're here today and you're like, Buck, that's the thing. If that gets you, then I'm going to say what I've said before, and it's true. Then please, if that's your obstacle and keeps you from listening and engaging in this series, give it somewhere else. Be generous somewhere else. But please be generous because there's benefits to your life. That's what the research says. So, As we think about generosity, here's what I want you to think about as we start this whole conversation. You know, we just looked at the science, and here's what science and, you know, the empirical data and research says over here, and the benefit to you, it's much more beneficial to you. But then over here we have God. And if you put God over here and you said, okay, God, what do you think about generosity? Like, does what God has to say, does that line up with science, or is that different than what science tells us? And oftentimes when we think about God and generosity, I mean, our thoughts are the idea like, God just wants my money. God just wants me to give and give and give. And I get that, but you know, I think we need to consider this. We actually know the answer to that question: how does God view generosity, and does it line up with science or not? And the reason why we know that is because Jesus talked about generosity all the time. He talked about money all the time. In fact, here's what's pretty cool. If you took all of Jesus' teachings and you were just to make an observation and say, what did Jesus talk about practically speaking more than anything else? Did you know that would be money? The most practical topic he talked about. Now the question is why? Did Jesus talk about money all the time because he's trying to get your money? He's like, gimme, gimme, gimme. I mean, we've got to think beyond that, the context of what Jesus' life was all about. I mean, Jesus was willing to give his life for you. He came for you. He's not trying to get something from you. He's not trying to get your money. I mean, he's the Son of the living God. He wants something for you. And it's so connected to what you do with your money. And so how does Jesus and God view money? And how does he view, does it line up with science? Well, again, what's so cool is we know because the Apostle Paul, first century follower of Jesus, he took the teachings of Jesus about money and generosity and he contextualized them in his letters. And Paul wrote approximately about half the New Testament, so he had a lot to say. And Paul would take the teachings of Jesus and say, okay, what's the tension? And he would contextualize them and go, okay, here's what Jesus taught us. And he did this with money and generosity. And in the letter of Corinthians, which is a letter to a group of brand new followers of Jesus in a town called Corinth. In the first century, the town called Corinth was like LA, New York, Vegas. It was like this kind of, you know, the bold, the rich, the famous, the beautiful, the powerful. They all had a place in Corinth. And there were people who were following Jesus in Corinth, and they were being generous. They were saying, hey, I'm being generous. But they were looking at the tension. And the tension is, Paul, I'm looking at my bank account. And when I'm generous, there's less in my bank account, and I'm really struggling with this tension. It feels like a deficit. It feels like a net loss. So can you help me understand how Jesus sees that tension? And Paul answers this, and I love the way he begins this whole discussion. Look at this. He starts the whole thing, and he says this. He says, remember this. In other words, don't forget it. Keep this in mind. Remember this. A farmer who plants only a few seeds will get a small crop. But the one who plants generously will get a generous crop. In other words, this is very simple. He's just saying, hey, if you take your seeds and you sow very little seeds, you get a little crop. But if you take your seeds and you sow very generously, you get a big old crop. That's his point. Now, let me pause and say two quick things that are really, really important. First and foremost, people who do what I do for entirely too long to line their own pockets in a very selfish way have abused this passage. And this passage has been used as a get-rich-quick kind of plan. Here's your scheme. Hey, you give $1, you're going to get 10. Hey, you give 10, you're going to get 100. You give 100, hey, you're going to get 1,000. If you give 1,000, oh, God's going to bless you richly. Guys, that's wrong. That is an abuse of this passage. Because when you do the hermeneutic, which is the science of interpretation, and then you do the homiletic, which is the idea to take your science of interpretation and then be able to teach it in its context, and you exegete the passage properly, there's no way Paul's getting at this idea to get rich quick. And if that's happened to you, if that's one of the reasons why when you saw the video pop up and money came up and you're like, oh, I'm just done with this. Guys, I get it. It's legitimate because of the abuse. And for what it's worth, if I can, I'm just sorry. It shouldn't have been that way. This passage shouldn't have been taught in that context. That's the first thing. The second thing is when it comes to generosity, I want all of us to be aligned on the same page. Because oftentimes when it comes to generosity, we think dollar amounts. We think, well, a generous person gives X amount of dollars. Here's the thing you've got to understand. When it came to generosity, Jesus taught percentage generosity. In other words, like the outcome of this, you could give millions and millions and millions of dollars and still not be generous according to what Jesus taught. And we see this in a lot of different places, but one primary example of this, one day Jesus is in the temple, and he's with his guys. He's got like Peter and James and John and the guys, and they're watching all the activities. There's a lot going on in the Jewish temple. And there's this big old kind of copper bowl, if you will, and this is where giving would take place. And the rich were coming into the temple, and they were carrying huge amounts of coins, and they were just pouring tons and tons of money into this big copper bowl, and it was making all this clashing and all this noise, and people were like, oh my gosh, look at the rich, they're so just honoring to God. God is blessing them, and wow, it's so impressive. They must have a great relationship with God. Look how generous. Now, the context of the passage seems to be Jesus is like not impressed. He's just kind of watching this going, okay, that's what they're doing. And then this widow walks up, has 2 coins, pennies, tink, tink. And Jesus goes, whoa, guys, James, John, not like literally, but it seems like from the context, it was dramatic. Guys, did you see that? And they're like, what? All the rich give all that tons and tons and tons of money? He's like, no. The widow, she gave 100%. That's impressive generosity. When it comes to generosity, it's really, really important to get alignment with what Jesus taught. It's about percentages, not about the amount. So let's go back to the initial tension and what Paul said. The tension is when I give, it feels like a net loss. When I'm generous, it feels like a deficit. Paul, can you help me with this? And how would Jesus respond? Well, Paul, he talked about seeds and a farmer and a crop. And his point is this. He says, farmers who sow seeds don't lose seeds. Guys, they gain a crop. You're missing the point here. And think about this illustration. Can you imagine a farmer who has all these seeds and the farmer's going, man, I really want a crop. But I'm looking at my seeds and I'm so nervous. My kid's going to have seeds. What about the weather? What about the ground? Is it going to rain? I don't know. And the whole time we're seeing, and then the farmer begins to pray, oh God, give me a crop. Give me a crop, please. And we're watching this. We would look at the farmer and say, hey, you got to plant the seeds to get the crop. The point Paul's making, and this is why this is such a brilliant illustration. He's saying, guys, generosity is an investment. It's an investment, not a loss. The farmer who sows doesn't lose seed, he gains a crop. What's the crop? Well, science tells us happiness, physical growth, hope and optimism for the future, purpose and meaning, and personal growth. And Jesus actually adds to that generosity is one of the things, one of the catalysts to your faith growing. And going, man, it feels like just every day God is with me as a result of your generosity. Jesus even goes so far to say, hey, your generosity has an impact in the kingdom to come. Generosity doesn't get you in heaven, but generosity is something you can invest in heaven to come and store up treasure in heaven through your generosity. There is a crop to this. And yes, sometimes the crops do provide the seeds. But Paul's point, when it comes to generosity, it's an investment. It takes time. And then he continues, and look at what he says next. He says, you must each decide in your heart how much to give. And don't miss this. This is so important. And don't give reluctantly or in response to pressure, for God loves a person who gives cheerfully. And then he continues, and he says, and God will generously provide all you need. Then you will always have everything you need and plenty left over to share with others. Now, one of the things I love he says here is when it comes to generosity, if it's all about guilt and religion, and you must give to pay God off, and you must give to make God happy, and you feel that kind of compulsion, that's your motive to give, don't give. Just don't give. Paul says, God loves a cheerful giver. So the question is, well, how do we allow our hearts to be cheerful when it comes to generosity, when it comes to money? Well, he gives us the key. He says, and God will generously provide all you need. So let's just get honest. Do you believe God knows exactly what you need? Do you believe God knows what you need tomorrow, next week, 20, 30 years from now? Do you believe he knows what you need? Do you believe God knows what your kids need, what your family needs in the future? Are you secure in that? How much confidence do you have in that? Or let me ask it a different way. This is kind of a rubber meets the road question. Who is better able to meet your needs? You or God? What do you believe about this one? Do you believe that you are more capable and better to meet your needs than God? Or do you believe God is more capable and he is better at meeting your needs than you? You know, for me personally, this is kind of those, rubber meets the road question. For me personally, I've shared with you guys a couple times that when, for Jill and I and generosity, there's been a couple occasions where God has called Jill and I to give 100%, to give it all. And when I say 100%, let me just clarify something real quick. It's not the idea that, hey, we sold our house, we sold all our cars, we sold our clothes, and there's Jill and I and our 5 sons naked on the side of the street. I mean, that's not what that's the extreme, and that's why we push back, and there's what God, no. Be financially responsible. I mean, for the needs of your family, of course, right? But I'm talking about this extra. I'm talking about what I worked for years and years and years at Dell to say, hey, what about our future? What about, when emergencies? What about all this kind? God said, I want you to give 100%. And I'm like, God, really? Yeah. And Jill and I had to get to the bottom of this question. Do we truly trust God is better at meeting our needs than us? Do we truly have confidence that God knows what we need next week? That God knows what our 5 sons need 5 years, 10 years from now? Do we believe that? Do we trust that? And what we've discovered is this. Is true wealth is having everything you need when you need it. That God is faithful. Now it gets tricky because in our culture, it's not wants. We got a lot of wants. Needs. True wealth is having everything you need when you need it. That God is faithful. The question is, do you trust him? Do you trust he knows what you need? And then Paul goes on, and he takes this even a layer deeper. And I love what he says. And he says, the scriptures say, they share freely and give generously to the poor. Their good deeds will be remembered forever. Again, this idea of generosity, Jesus attaches this all the time. He's like, hey, in the kingdom to come, in heaven to come, you can do something with your very finite life today to send investments ahead. You can do that. But the other thing Paul gives us insight here, it's so cool. He says, when you choose to be generous, you align your life with the activities of God. You get kind of a front row seat to what God is doing, and you get to see the impact of your generosity. And guys, I've seen this time and time again. I think one of the coolest things for Jill and I is over the summer when, as a church, we do Camp 75. There we go. Yeah, I don't know where you came from, but I'm with you. Oh, there you are. Yeah, Camp 75. It's what our next generation, middle school, high school, they go and serve our community. It's so cool because it's this next generation going, here's my faith, and they're developing a faith of their own. They're seeing the activity of God around the city. It's unbelievable to see the leadership development and people's faith grow. It's so cool. And during the week at Camp 75, what happens at the end of the day is all the students come back in this room, and they pile in, and it looks something like this. I mean, it's just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of middle schoolers, high schoolers, smells like a big old wet locker room, whatever that smells like. You're like, okay, here we go, because they've been out all day sweating and serving, and it's awesome. And one of the things that Jill and I do is we stand at NASA headquarters back there so we can kind of elevate and see what's going on. And we listen to story after story after story of the next generation go, man, God has come alive. Man, it was so cool to be able to serve. It was so cool to be able to see how God showed up. Man, my faith, I'm just telling you, God has never been this real to me. And as we stand there, inevitably, at some point, I'll grab her leg, she'll grab mine, and we'll get emotional, and tears will stream down our face, and we'll go, it's worth it. This is so meaningful. This is so purposeful. There's so much joy and being able to be part of what's happening. You know, I think about a couple weeks ago, if you were here a few weeks ago, I had the privilege and honor to baptize Cheryl. Now, Cheryl, her story is a remarkable story, and I got to get in the tub with her over there, whatever you call that thing. You know, I know it's a baptismal, but I call it the tub, you know. And we got in the tub, and I'm standing there with Cheryl, and I asked her the question. I said, Cheryl, have you placed your faith and trust in Jesus Christ? Because that's what baptism's all about. And she looked at me, and she said, yes. And I looked at her, and if you were here, you saw this. I said, man, I'm so honored to do this because I am in the presence of genuine life change. I get to stand face to face with the impact of generosity and talk about floods of happiness and joy and purpose and contentment and meaning and significance come rushing in. That's Paul's point. Your generosity aligns your life with the activities of God, and you get a front row seat. And then he wraps it all up, and he says this. He says, for God is the one who provides seed for the farmer and then bread to eat. In the same way, he will provide and increase your resources and then produce a great harvest of generosity in you. And then he wraps it up and he says, yes, you will be enriched in every way so that you can always be generous. And when we take your gifts to those who need them, they'll thank God. Wow, God is so real. God is so active. My life has changed. It's a result of your generosity and your generosity and your generosity. Man, to get a front row seat, to be part of that, there's nothing more meaningful. Paul's point with this last passage, God will provide. He knows exactly what you need. God will provide. God will provide. And if you summarized what Paul said in terms of what did Jesus teach about this tension that we're facing, generosity feels like a net loss deficit, you could summarize Paul's teaching and say, guys, giving we receive, grasping we lose. Exactly as science has taught us and uncovered 2,000 years later. That generosity certainly has an impact here, but it has a much greater impact here. And what's the impact? Well, the impact, happiness, physical health, purpose in life, avoidance of depression, personal growth. So, let me just ask you a question. And I really want you to think about this because I do want you to take steps and experience what science actually says we benefit from. For you personally, what's holding you back from being generous? What's keeping you from taking that next step and that next step and that next step in terms of generosity? Is it education and information? Like, honestly, are you going like, Buck, I've just never heard of this stuff. I've always thought about generosity as like, I got to muster up a bunch of energy to go, there's needs out there, and okay, I'll kind of help those needs. But I've never heard, like, I'm going to get that book called, The Paradox of Generosity. I'm going to read that because if that's the empirical research and the empirical data, I mean, I can't really argue with it. I just need education, and that's what's holding me back. Maybe that's it for you. Or maybe for you, you would say, Buck, I'm telling you, I'm in a pickle financially. Financially, I am so far underwater. I'm so far, debt and all that. I can't even think about this idea of generosity. Maybe that's holding you back. Or maybe it's just fear. Fear sounds like, what if? What about? What if the economy? What if inflation? What about my future? What about my kids? Maybe it's fear. Or maybe it's greed. Greed is this idea, it's so self-seeking. I worked hard for this. This is all my money. I'm going to do whatever I want with my money. Or maybe it's just the kingdom kind of building stuff. Kingdom building can keep you from being generous. And Jesus was so clear. He said, do not store for yourself up treasure on earth. All this stuff, it's taken all your energy, all your resources, all your time, all the insurance companies, all this stuff, and you're so busy building this, and rust and moths will destroy. He says, instead, build up for yourself treasure in heaven. Store up for yourself treasure in heaven. Maybe the reason why generosity is so difficult is because you're building your kingdom here. You're so busy building this and making this bigger and increasing your territory and all, and you're so consumed with this that you've lost sight of what Jesus called you to make your primary place of generosity. Maybe it's kingdom building. What is it for you? Just honestly, it's keeping you from being generous. And then, let me ask you this question. Have you ever invited God into your finances? Like, legitimately. Have you ever just said, God, I got paid today. Okay, here it is. What do you want me to do? God, I got this bonus today. God, hey, this source of income came in. What do you want me to do with it? How would you want me to allocate this? How would you want me to be generous with this? And can I just lean into something, and I want to be very careful. You know this context, or this idea of 10% in churches? You know, all too often I hear this all the time. Oh, hey, whenever you give, just make sure you give 10%. 10%. And I get it. There's a practical side that's a good guardrail and all that kind of stuff. But oftentimes 10% is just a religion. It's so religious. It's just, okay, I got to pay God off. Hey, every month I just give 10%. God, are you happy now? God, okay, I'm going to pay you off. I'm going to pay you off. I'm going to pay you off. I mean, that's a religious activity. God has invited us into something so much greater. I mean, he gave his one and only son for us so that we could have peace with God, have a relationship with God, and say, God, I'm inviting you in. God, what would you have me do? This is far better than the 10%. Because here's the deal. Sometimes when you go, God, here it is. What do you want me to do? Sometimes God will go, the percentage is 0. I want you to do something different than what you typically have done. Sometimes that's what God will say. Sometimes God's going to say, hey, I want you to give 5%. I want you to give 20%. I want you to give 50%. And then at that point, you're like, whoa, right? But this is so relational. God doesn't want a religion from you. Let me check the box. God, I'm paying you off. Are you happy now? No. God's like, come on, kiddo. Let's talk about it. Man, I got good things for you. Let's have a conversation about your generosity. What's holding you back? And have you invited God into this conversation? And if you choose to do that, whatever God calls you to do, the last point I want you to hear, go for it. Just go for it and be generous. And even if you're here today or you're watching or listening online and you're not a follower of Jesus, maybe you have far more questions about Jesus than being a follower of Jesus. Man, I'm just telling you, from a naturalistic framework, I mean, atheists would look at this, agnostics would look at this and go, oh yeah, let me just look at the empirical data, let me look at the research, let me look at what's objective. Well, fantastic, look at what's objective. Generosity, if you're not a follower of Jesus, man, you gotta go for it. You gotta consider what is it that you're comfortable with, being generous with, and go for it. It has such benefit to your life according to the science. And if you're a follower of Jesus, this is what we're called to do. This is what it looks like to be a follower of Jesus. That followers of Jesus should be some of the most radically generous people on the planet. So, what has God called you to do? What's keeping you from being generous? And then whatever God, as you invite him in, calls you to do, go for it. Just go for it. Because I'm telling you, what we know is Paul teaches us when you sow seeds, it's an investment, there's a crop. And what is the crop? Happiness, physical growth, purpose and meaning, avoidance of depression, hope for the future, and a life that you look 5 years, 10 years and go, man, I love the direction my life has gone. Part of that is because you chose to be generous. That's what I want for all of us. Let me pray for us. Father, thank you so much that we can have this conversation. And God, here's the deal. The thing I just want to ask you is, you know far more than any of us about money, about our hearts, about our lives, about our needs. And so I know money, I mean, you told us money's like the biggest competition with you. It's the number one thing. There's nothing that compares with money and you. And so, God, you know what we're attached to. You know our fears. You know what's going on. So, Father, this week, please, in only the way that you can, would you meet us? would you begin to enter into those places that are holding us back from something that's good for us? And would you give us the courage to trust you? God, you know exactly what that looks like. And I trust you with that. In Jesus' name, amen. Guys, thanks so much for being here. I'll see you next week.